Okay, been having a little conversation with Tim Kilgore lately about, the idea of Christians having a hope that could be wrong based on an ancient religious text that could be wrong, and it being just their interpretation of that religious text that could be wrong. And I talked to him about the whole notion of the interpretation and that, the interpretation that a Christian has that they will be spending time with God in heaven after they die and ultimately being resurrected wasn't a matter of just, pulling a couple passages out of a book and thinking, all right, that's what it kind of sounds like to me, but it's in fact something that is, supported heavily by the unanimous testimony of the earliest church fathers. So I want to touch on the whole notion of the hope itself. The hope that a Christian has, it is founded firmly and solely on the shoulders of the notion that Jesus of Nazareth died, was buried, and rose from the dead on the third day. And if this didn't happen, we may as well just pack it up and go home. So I want to kind of look at this hope in a series of videos. And this first one, I just want to take a look at one of the documents themselves that talks about the resurrection of Jesus, that being the Gospel of Mark. That was probably the first gospel written about, first biography, shall we say, written about the life of Christ and his resurrection. Now, some might say, yeah, what about the Q documents? Well, we just don't know. Were there Q documents? Yes, no. We don't have them, so we don't know. We're going to base this upon extant manuscripts, and Mark is probably the first written story of the life of Jesus Christ. Now let's paint a picture here. Jesus has died, has stayed dead, has not actually appeared to anyone, and the apostles still want to propagate his message anyway. They think they have a lot. They've already sunk a good part of their time into this, and they agree we're not going to look like fools. We're going to preach this man to be resurrected. So they do, and it's meeting with some good degree of success, surprisingly. And it comes time for the story to be written down about him, to gain more converts. How would we go about writing that story down? What kind of a story would we tell? If it's time to gin up a story about the life of Jesus of Nazareth, what would we do? I think you do your best to portray him as someone, since he is supposed to be the Jewish Messiah, someone who knew his Old Testament up, down, and inside out. Certainly you wouldn't want to portray him as getting the facts wrong about, Old Testament chronology. Yet, on the surface, is that not what happens in Mark 2:26? Does he not, in Mark 2:26, he's getting into an argument with the Jewish legalists about what he's doing, and he makes an appeal to the Old Testament and saying that, did not, in the days of Abiathar the high priest, David do something? Well, yeah, I think it had to do with David eating showbread in the temple or something like that. Whereas, in actuality, that happened when Ahimelech was the high priest. So, at least on the surface, it would appear that Jesus got it wrong. If I was ginning up a story, I don't know if I would include that little narrative, or at least I'd make sure to edit it and say, geez, that was a goof by Jesus. I'm going to make sure I'm going to let him get it right. But, and that verse has been seized upon by critics, worldwide and over the millennia as an example of the Bible not being inspired by God. It was one of the things that caused Bart Ehrman's faith to unravel into agnosticism. So there's that. And if you're a Christian watching this, my goal here is anything but for the sake of stumbling your faith. If any of these biblical difficulties trouble you, please drop me an email. I'll be happy to give you the whole story. Anyway, so yeah, if we were going to gin up a story about Jesus to try to get people to believe that he's the man, that he really is the Messiah of God, and that he really did rise from the dead, I think I'd want to portray him as positive a light as possible, and not have him do things that might be construed on the surface as being bizarre. Yet what does Mark say in Mark chapter 10? He's passing by a fig tree, and it's not the season for fig trees to be bearing any fruit. And Jesus is hungry, wants some fruit from it, sees no fruit on it, and curses the fig tree and says, "May you never grow fruit again." Well, on the surface, that's kind of dumb. And it's kind of bratty on the surface, seeing a tree that shouldn't be bearing, it's not the season for it to bear fruit at all, seeing that it has no fruit and saying, "Oh yeah, well you're never going to bear fruit again," and zing, you can't bear fruit. I don't know if I would be, that verse has caused a lot of people to say, well, look at what an immature brat Jesus was, and look at how dumb he was. A lot of people have said that based upon that part in Mark, but Mark put it in. If I was going to gin up a story about Jesus of Nazareth, I think that I would portray him as having, pretty discerning judgment. And yet, what does Mark talk about in Mark chapter 14? But, talking about how Judas Iscariot betrayed him. This is one of the guys that Jesus chose to be his apostles. Did he not have the foresight? Or forget about foresight. Was he not a good enough judge of character that he couldn't pick someone better than some, money-loving scumbag who's going to sell him down the river for 30 pieces of silver? So there's that. But Mark put it in. If I was going to gin up a story about Jesus of Nazareth being the Messiah, if there was, one of the head honchos propagating his movement, that namely being Simon Peter Bar-Jonah, I want that guy to look like a titan in that story, because people were listening to Peter. He was rocky. He was one of the pillars of the church. I don't know if I'd be going out of my way to portray him as an impulsive chicken crap coward who on one minute says, "I'm never going to portray you, Lord. Everybody else might, but no, sir, not me." And then the next minute, when the pressure's on, him saying, "I never knew the man, I don't know the man, I don't know what you're talking about." Because if I'm reading that document and, seeing Peter as one of the hot dogs in the church, I'm thinking to myself, I'm not going to listen to this guy. Or for that matter, if I'm reading the document after Peter dies in, let's say, 85 AD, I'm going to say, this is the big shot that everybody's revering in death. And, if I'm going to gin up a story about Jesus rising from the dead, and I'm the first one to do so, I'm going to make sure after he rises from the dead that everybody sees him, puts their hands on him, gives him something to eat, that he dances a bloody jig. And what does Mark do at the end of his story? He sees, he portrays, women as approaching the tomb ready to anoint his body with spices. An angel tells them, or I'm trying to think in his version, it might have said a young man, that don't seek the living among the dead. Jesus isn't here. He is risen as he said. And having women leave the tomb terrified. And boom, that's it. So that's me. If I was going to be, making up a story to gain converts, that's what I would have it say. That's me. Especially if the story's a lie. But Mark did none of those things. He portrayed, on the surface, Jesus got it wrong about the high priest. On the surface, Jesus looked like a bratty kid throwing a temper tantrum. On the surface, it looked like he couldn't pick an apostle to save his life. Peter looked like a chicken crap coward. And, it's kind of left almost ambiguous. Well, did he really rise from the dead? That's what I would do if I was going to make a story up to, if the whole story of Jesus of Nazareth was a lie. But Mark did none of those things. The fact that he did none of those things kind of makes me wonder if he wasn't just relaying the facts as he got them. I think we can agree on this much. If Mark was ginning up a story, he did a lousy job in doing it.